ambassadors of the kingdom of God. So what is it we represent? We're representing the kingdom of God and teachings around sexuality and gender. We're representing that to a culture that's increasingly unfamiliar with the ways that we think about these things. So we're not going to have as much in common with other neighbors, other people in our life who are going to be more steeped in the broader cultural ways of thinking about sexuality and gender.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast, helping leaders live with integrity.
All right. Well, we're so excited to have you with us today, especially for this conversation. Now, I'm going to give just kind of a flatline disclaimer just to settle all of our reactions, because whether you're on the more conservative side of the church, maybe the progressive side of the church, maybe you personally have a journey in, we're talking about sexuality and gender identity. It's a really important topic, so I should probably say that first. But really, wherever you're at, whether this is your own story, whether you are raising kids today, whether you are walking alongside teens and young adults, whether you have someone you love who this has been their journey, wherever you're at in this process, you're going to possibly be triggered along the way, maybe be challenged in your thinking. But what we're hoping is that you'll stick it out with us and that you will be able to be more aware of how to come to this conversation with more grace and the nuances that it requires, particularly if you're a parent and wanting to be very intentional to talk to your kids today. So we have a special guest with us who's going to help us do that.
Yeah, our guest today is Dr. Mark Yarhouse. He's an award-winning teacher, psychologist, and researcher who's authored numerous books and articles, including the featured white paper on sexual identity for the Gospel Coalition's Christ on Campus initiative. He's the director of the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute at Wheaton College, and has spent the majority of his career studying and writing about the world of gender identities. His latest book, Talking to Kids About Gender Identity, A Roadmap for Christian Compassion, Civility, and Conviction, is a thorough, practical guide for Christian parents to use as they navigate daunting conversations with their children from a biblical perspective. Dr. Yarhouse, it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Well, this is a topic we personally get asked about all the time in all our spheres of influence. And so we try every so often on the podcast to invite somebody in to have a conversation along the spectrum of where this conversation goes. But before we dive in, I think it'd be just fun to get to know you a little bit better about you and your story and how it shapes what you're doing today in your expertise here on sexual and gender identity.
Yeah, it's, I don't know how interesting it is, but I did not go to graduate school to study these issues. I was going to study marriage and family, working with couples, working with families. I was in my second year, I think, of the program, and the director of the program asked me to be his research assistant. And it was just such an honor to be asked. I just said yes without knowing what we were going to be working on. And so I went to the first meeting, and he had a couple of lines of research, but one of them was on sexual identity. And we worked together on that project, became the first book I wrote with him. And he then became the senior academic administrator at the school, so he wasn't working closely with me anymore. And I ended up doing a lot of writing and research and things like that for him over the next probably 4 years. And then when I graduated, I looked around. There were no Christians in the field of psychology looking at these issues of sexual and gender that I knew, that I could find. And the Christians outside of psychology didn't seem to be as familiar with the research that I'd been familiar with working, as a research assistant with my mentor. So I sort of held it loosely. I still had other things I was interested in, but I prayed about it. And, that first fall, I was at a conference, and these issues came up at a conference, and I was a part of informal conversations about that. Families were being referred to my private practice to meet with them. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I meet with families in this space. So I was kind of, that was the very beginning. The doors just seemed to open. I mean, I've written some other things, but no one has read those things. So I mostly am in this space. And and continue to write, but the door's open. And it felt very much like missional, like, okay, this is something I should be a good steward of the training and education I'd received for those many years. So I think that helped me a little bit early on in some very heated conversations, that I didn't come in having an axe to grind. I wasn't pushing an agenda. I was really just, coming in with research and clinical experience. And I think it sort of brought the temperature down in some of the situations that I've encountered early on in my career.
It's a good place to start.
Okay, so we live in the Pacific Northwest and have been working with families and parents for the last 15 years, struggling with how to lean into this conversation. It's now more prevalent in the rest of the country. Give some of the context from your years of research on why gender identity is now such a major topic of conversation in society, or does it seem that way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. I think it, even when I started my training and early career, gender was not a big conversation. I worked with a number of people navigating sexual identity. Let me just define these terms for just a second. But sexual identity has to do with labeling yourself with reference to your sexual attractions or your orientation. So if you have a teenager who says that they're gay or lesbian or bisexual or straight, they're using sexual identity labels to communicate to you about their attractions, their orientation. So that's one conversation. And that's been more central in the cultural conversation with gay marriage and a lot of different things over the years. But gender identity is how a person identifies themselves as a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, or a different experience than that. And when I say different experience, now you're getting into, do they have a cross-gender identity, like we call it transgender identity? Or do they say that they're non-binary, so that their gender identity is not with reference to a binary between boy and girl or man or woman? So they're somewhere in between that binary, or they might say that they're outside of a binary. So anyway, and I'm happy to define all these terms as we go, but gender identity has definitely become more salient in our culture in the last 10 or so years, 15 years. It's, in fact, when I first wrote a book on gender identity, the reason I did it was I was doing training at youth ministry conferences on sexual identity. How should youth pastors respond when a child is, or teenagers navigating questions of sexual identity and saying that they're queer and things like that? Well, about 2010, 2011, I would do 3-hour workshops, hour and a half workshops, and I get done, and all of the Q&A was on gender identity. People were asking me about transgenderism and non-binary, and so I realized that youth ministers were telling us that our culture is shifting towards this conversation. So I actually approached my editor at InterVarsity at that time and asked them told them a little bit about this, and I pitched a book that I never thought I would write on gender. And so, they weren't sure whether they were going to get behind it, but they said, I had written for them before, and they said, well, let's just keep him, keep him happy or whatever. So they gave me this contract. And the month that it was published was the same month that Caitlyn Jenner transitioned. And so that really became a milestone in some of the cultural discourse around gender, if you think about it. Time magazine, I think either that year or maybe the year before, talked about the transgender tipping point and had Laverne Cox, a well-known transgender actress, on the cover of that magazine. So, it became very centrally located in our conversations. And so this new book is how do parents even engage that conversation with their kids?
It is something interesting on the inside of, working in clinical practice where parents, I remember I've been in the field for 20 years. And I remember the first times when parents were coming and saying, my child is going by a different gender at school. We live in Oregon, and they're coming home. So they're known as Sarah, but they're going by Adam at school. Can you help? And so slowly but surely, this became more of a norm. It was kind of an exception at the time, and then slowly moving forward. And now it's just very prevalent at least in our communities up in the Pacific Northwest. And a very common question up front, right? Like, how do you identify? And the labels are vast. So you might have to define, but I know once we get you started, there's a lot to define. But clarify at least where you see gender dysphoria, if you could define that too for our audience, but gender dysphoria and transgenderism, how are they related? How are they different? What are the things that you're seeing in the nuances in your research and in your work?
Yeah, so gender dysphoria is more of a condition, something that people might be diagnosed with. Transgenderism or transgender identity is more of an identification that's a bit of an umbrella term for many ways that people experience or express or live out a gender identity that doesn't correspond with biological markers. So common biological markers like chromosomes, gonads, genitalia would distinguish sex, male and female. And so for most people, their gender identity corresponds with those biological markers. They're anchored in them. But for a percentage of people, there's not that concordance. So we might call it gender discordant. It's not lining up the way that I think as a Christian you would say that it was intended from creation. And so when there's that gender discordance present and it's distressing to someone, we call it gender dysphoria. So if euphoria is a positive emotional state, dysphoria is a negative emotional state that's associated with that lack of concordance between gender identity and biological markers. And that distress can be mild, can be moderate, can be severe. And when you meet with someone, or as a parent, you watch your child, they'll on their own sort of gravitate towards strategies to manage that dysphoria, to mitigate it. And so, for example, when a biological female wears baggy clothing, so she's not as attuned to like her body shape and curves and things like that, that might be a strategy that she's using. She might keep her hair cut very short. That might help lower the distress of that dysphoria. A biological male might wear his hair longer as a preference, might wear long sleeves to hide secondary sex characteristics like body hair that would be distressing, or they might choose to shave that hair, things like that. These are like strategies people will use to help lessen the severity of the dysphoria. So when you meet someone in that space, they may already take those steps. Now, not everybody who identifies as transgender has this condition of dysphoria, so they're often kind of treated as almost synonymous, but not everybody in that space would meet the criteria for what I'm describing. And a number of people who do meet the criteria don't personally identify with the transgender community as like a movement or a community. They're more comfortable with the diagnosis and saying, I have a condition, so they might just talk about it differently. So there's a lot of variation in the community here.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of bring it down into a bit more story is that it generations ago that would have been more normalized, and now a parent gets really heightened. So a 13-year-old girl, her body shape is very curvy. There's outside influences, maybe her story, her timeline. She's experienced some hard things along the way with being female and uncomfortable, or maybe culturally there's some connotations with that. So wearing baggy clothes for her, we might not have reacted to that in the same way now in this more heightened culture where everybody's really focused more on a language, gender identity, and teens are using language more. So I'm just curious about your thought on that, because I've just seen the shift. I mean, I personally, and you've heard this before, Dr. Yarhouse, I personally was very tomboy. I was very uncomfortable with my female to the point of where I struggled with an eating disorder because of my story piece. And when I walked with a lot of teenagers, that gender dysphoria shows up in lots of different ways. But it can get confused, especially by parents, and they start to get really uncomfortable. And so speak to the research. What's the population that has gender dysphoria? What's the population that's truly transgender? And do we need to get hung up on that, especially if you're speaking to parents, less to clinicians?
Yeah, that's a good question. So gender dysphoria is usually estimated very rare. Even if you look at the recent diagnostic manual that mental health professionals cite to make diagnostic classifications, um, gender dysphoria is described as pretty rare. But they're using studies that were done in Europe, in the Netherlands, of adults who were seeking medical care at a gender clinic. And so you know that the prevalence is going to be much greater if you include adolescents and children and people who are not seeking medical care, because most adults, at least in the US, don't actually pursue medical interventions in this space. And so once you start to include all those exceptions, like, okay, what about not just adults and what about not just seeking medical care?
Mm-hmm.
You end up getting quite a much more expansive possible prevalence estimate. So I think we're looking at about 1% of the population. But what we're seeing in I think the last Gallup poll was that it was quite a bit more, a greater percentage when you looked at like um, Gen Z versus millennials or Gen X. And so every generation that got younger had a higher percentage. And when you got older into like Gen X and boomers, it was less commonly common that people would identify as transgender, let alone have this condition we call gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is probably a lot more rare than that, but still probably much higher than what's said in the diagnostic manual, where it's really underestimated. So anyway, you are seeing an increase, and we're also seeing an increase in atypical cases. So when I started my career, you would almost always see um, children with what we called early onset, meaning it was before puberty. And the other kind is late onset, which is at the time of puberty or after, anytime after that is called late onset. And so throughout my career, early on, you would see early onset cases, mostly boys, about 4-to-1, 5-to-1 ratio of boys to girls. And the explanation was kind of what you said about yourself as a tomboy, is that you would see more boys referred to a gender clinic because there was not as much latitude for a boy if he was atypical in some way.
Right.
Whereas for a girl, she could be atypical, but there was a positive word in English for that. Well, she's a tomboy. You wouldn't even really think about it that much. So you didn't get those types of referrals. But for boys, you did tend to get those referrals. And what we're seeing today are atypical presentations of more adolescent girls coming in than boys, about 4-to-1 ratio. It's more girls than boys, and it's late onset. So these are 15-year-olds who had no history of gender atypical expression in childhood that we know of. And here they are at 14 or 15 telling their parents that they're non-binary or they're transgender. And so I think that that's raised a lot of concern for parents, for some gender specialists, but those shifts, increased prevalence, and that gender flip of girls to boys is something we're seeing at every clinic globally that keeps data on this. So the Netherlands, the UK, the US. And so I think, these are hallway conversations. What is going on? And I don't think anyone has a great answer to that, but a lot of speculation as to what's going on. And that's led to a lot of really difficult conversations and choices that parents are facing.
Yeah. And I think before we dive into the conversations parents need to be having, I really do want to go there, if you're willing, to say, what are we speculating? I know when I get asked, here's my answer. You can disagree or add to it, and you can disagree or add to it.
Yeah.
My speculation has been, and again, just the way that I see the brain development and the neuroscience on biological female brains and biological male brains. Women are just a lot more, the female brain's a little bit more inner. We go back and forth between the cognitive and the emotional a little quicker. And the relational piece of female, what some term as social contagions. And I know that is a term you kind of say, let's be careful on that. So I want you to speak to that. but girls just being more aware of others. We shape a lot of who we are as we're looking around the room, getting feedback a little bit. Not that boys don't, but that is just a tendency for female formation. And then you add in the digital age. We saw in 2006 the iPhone, and then you add on social media. And so through the droves of children having access to all those voices, that's a piece to the puzzle. It's not the only part, but I definitely, when parents are going, what's happening? I go, this current population, these Gen Zs, have a phone in their hand and access to social media that earlier generations didn't have. So it's having a role, and maybe more so in girls than boys. So that's my starting point. You want to add, shift, reframe something?
Yeah, I mean, you may be right. I think the two most common explanations right now would be self-awareness, and the other would be social contagion. And so right there, I think what you're saying is a little more nuanced than just simply one or the other. But
Right.
so self-awareness would just be people who say, look, these kids have always been there. They've always been in this space, but they didn't have social sort of permission to sort of speak their truth, name who they are, so on and so forth. And so as society is more accepting, we hit that transgender tipping point, you're going to have more people give permission to be honest about their experience. So, I mean, in some ways, that's obviously true. I mean, yes, there would be a greater prevalence because of social acceptance. I've known people in their 50s and 60s who have said to me, I wish I was a young adult today, because when I was a young adult, I had no idea what this was. Like one person I evaluated in their 50s, they were going to, when they were in a young adult, they would go to the libraries and scour medical textbooks just to kind of, what's wrong with me? And they thought they were suffering from like schizophrenia or, a psychotic disorder. So to come along the words at the time that would describe what we call gender dysphoria, it was like a relief. Okay, this is a real thing. So there is that. Okay, I agree with that. But I think it's naive to say that that's all that's going on. It wouldn't explain that gender ratio flip, more females, late onset, like what's going on there. And so I think the alternative has been social contagion. And that's the idea that, kind of like a virus, these things get passed along peer groups. And so, maybe something like that's happening. And this comes out of actually something you were talking about earlier, the eating disorder literature, where eating disorders are viewed as one of the most culture-bound syndromes we have, meaning it's, in a sense, your society, your culture contributes to the onset and maintenance of an eating disorder because of standards of beauty and idealized body weight, shape, and size, things like that are communicated through entertainment, media, peer group, and they're passed along. And so what has been well established in the eating disorder literature is that adolescent females are a little more susceptible to that than adolescent males, and it can contribute to the beginning and maintenance of eating disorders. And the reason why I just say so some people have said, okay, that's what's happening here. So they've kind of copied and pasted that over here and said, that's what's happening here. And it may very well be. But what you have in the eating disorder literature is a lot of lines of research showing that. You have systematic reviews demonstrating that claim. So I just get a little wary of just saying it looks like the same thing, it must be the same thing. And I'm not denying there's peer group influence, that there's those types. This definitely can be a trend in this space. I think all of those things are possible. I describe it a little differently. I call it a looping effect. And I'll try to explain it briefly, but all I'm saying here, this is coming from another author. He's a philosopher named Ian Hacking, but he just would say, look, when you categorize people, people respond to how they're categorized. And one of the main ways we categorize people is through diagnoses. And so when you diagnose people with gender dysphoria, or what we used to call gender identity disorder, they respond individually and as a group of people to how they're being categorized. And I think we can do a mental exercise really quick. If this was your experience and you were diagnosed with a gender identity disorder, you would probably think of yourself differently than if you were diagnosed today with gender dysphoria, because the previous diagnosis said it's the identity that's the disorder. That discordance is the issue. We should resolve that. Gender dysphoria just says it's the distress that's the issue. It's not an identity issue. So you can be transgender, you can be non-binary. We just need to reduce your distress. And I think that's why so many people gravitate towards transitioning, because that's a strategy for lowering your distress, right? But it's not making a statement about your identity. So I think, okay, so you're categorized differently than you ever were before. And then you have you have the people who interact with those diagnoses. You have the institutions like mine, others that interview them and learn about them and rework their theories about people like that. Then you have what becomes taken for granted knowledge on talk shows, in entertainment, in media. So people say, well, there's 50 plus genders. And you say, okay, well, there's 50 plus genders. So we sort of, then Christians come along and we say, well, I think there's two. And so you end up sort of you're an outlier in the conversation as a Christian, because society has moved towards new, taken for granted realities. And then the last part of this looping effect are the experts who get to determine, of all the ideas that get generated, what counts as true knowledge about this topic. And that group will lead to a new way of classifying people based on all of what I've said so far. So I think all of that might be a little more in play in this than just self-awareness and just social contagion. And I would put peer group influence under that taken for granted realities in society. There's a lot of pressure in society to take for granted things that we begin to share as knowledge in this area. And I think teens would be susceptible to that, just as adults are, just as parents are.
Yeah, but maybe a little bit more because their brain's under construction and they're in the identity formation stages. So just a little bit more. But I love that. I love the way to think more holistically and a little bit more nuanced. But there's a lot of things contributing, basically. Did you want to say anything before we move forward?
No, I think it's
okay.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the 3 C's here. So I'd love to ask a little bit about that, Dr. Yarhouse. So the 3 C's of being a cultural ambassador, why are compassion, civility, and conviction so crucial when discussing sex and gender with our kids or anyone for that matter?
Yeah, exactly. So part of what I want to avoid are the two extremes that I see in Christian circles around really difficult topics. So one would be the culture warrior. And this is a person who the posture they take is that we are at war. And so any sense of like either nuance or compassion towards people in this space is threatening. So it's like, no, I'm not going to budge. I'm going to stand my ground. I'm at war. And there's sort of a feel embattled almost in these conversations. I don't think that's going to end up being very constructive for the Christian or very helpful as a posture to take towards this topic. The other extreme, though, would be the cultural capitulator. And this is the person who says, okay, well, there's 50 plus genders, there's 50 plus genders. They never seem to bring their Christian worldview to bear on a topic, right? They're just like, okay, let me know where we're at, and I'll just jump in with that. So we want to avoid those two extremes. And the language I used, which is used in Scripture, is that we should be ambassadors. We're ambassadors of the kingdom of God. So what is it we represent? We're representing the kingdom of God and teachings around sexuality and gender. We're representing that to a culture that's increasingly unfamiliar with the ways that we think about these things. So we're not going to have as much in common with other neighbors, other people in our life who are going to be more steeped in the broader cultural ways of thinking about sexuality and gender. So ambassadorship should be characterized by something. And I just suggested these 3 C's. I'm borrowing here a little bit from former president at Fuller Theological Seminary, Richard Mouw. He described how Christians should have convicted civility.
Yes.
And what he would say is we have far too many Christians who are strong on convictions, but you wouldn't want them to represent you to the broader culture. They're just not nice people. But we also have Christians who are so strong on civility, you have no idea what they believe in. That's not going to work either. So you need convicted civility. And maybe because I'm a psychologist, like you, I would say maybe we want to add compassion to that. Like if this is not your experience, your family hasn't been down this road, maybe a little bit of compassion and empathy for the challenges they're facing could be good for an ambassador. So ambassadorship is, I hold these convictions about sexuality and gender. Like I believe that gender identity is meant to be tethered to our biological sex, that they're not just do what you want, create what you want, kind of a phenomenon, which some people would teach that. I actually think gender and gender identity are meant to be tethered to your biological sex, and that's from creation. Now, for some people, that experience is not the way they experience things. So could we have some compassion towards them as they navigate that? And as we are in public dialogues about these things, could we demonstrate civility? Because I think how you carry what you hold to be true is going to be increasingly important as a cultural witness, as a person of faith. So it's not just what you believe, that's important. How you hold what you believe is also going to be important because people are watching you. How you communicate things you hold to be true when your reference point is scripture and it's not the reference point of other people in the same room having this conversation. So holding that with convicted civility and compassion is what I think ambassadorship should look like.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I just was having a conversation over Marco Polo with an old friend of mine. We went to Seattle Pacific University, which was in the news in the last 5 years with all of this conversation. And she was just sitting in her congregation. She's in public school, teaching first and second grade, has public school in Seattle, Washington, curriculum, sex education curriculum that she's teaching. And so she gets a lot of feedback from parents in the area who are on both sides of that spectrum. And the pastor was recently speaking and just felt the venom in his voice. And so we were just talking to say, I wonder what his story is. I wonder what this is hitting for him. So usually when people are on both sides of the coin, there's something in their story or in their context. So even us slowing down and having compassion in other people's reactions. We were just talking about kind of this, it's like this ripple effect. You have to have it compassion for the person who's sitting in front of you, but just also everybody else's pendulum swings right now. It's just really hard. So thinking about every parent right now holding their own story, a lot of them don't know what they don't know, Dr. Yarhouse. I think the education right now around child development, around sexual formation, around what's the latest and greatest in the research. They just know their kids are coming home and have lots of friends and questions, and they see their kids shifting in the way that they're dressing. And so let's talk about parents who are raising kids today. How are they bringing these 3 C's into their parenting? What do you want to see in terms of parents being very intentional with their own children? We can't help everybody out in the world, but maybe we can kind of be intentional with our own kiddos. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So one principle to follow as a parent would be, let's start by recognizing that no parent I've ever met has said, I parented at my best when I parented out of my fears. Okay. So let's start by identifying what your fears are in this space. Would I say the wrong thing? Would I not represent my Christian faith adequately? Would I turn my kid off from ever talking to me about this again because of something I said about their friend at school? What would your fears be? Okay. So I think we want to reduce fear-based ways of parenting. So let's take a sheet of paper out and let's jot down our fears. What would they be in this conversation? What would those fears be? And then what you want to do is you want to be able to process those fears with another adult, not your children, another adult who can help you think through and kind of make sense of where those fears originated and what they're about for you. You don't necessarily have to go see a professional counselor to do that. You can, but that's what good friends are for. Maybe your home group, maybe help you identify your fears. And the reason you do that is so that they don't come out sideways in less healthy ways when you're interacting with your child or your adolescent. Okay. And so then you want to think about, well, what are my convictions? What do I believe? What does Christianity teach about sexuality and gender? So like one time, and you can do this purposely, like in conversations with your kids, just like you do teaching them about sexuality and sexual behavior and values and things like that. That's a developmental thing you do throughout their time you're parenting them. Like that's a very important part of raising your children. So you could have an intentional conversation about gender and gender identity and things like that that's age appropriate. But sometimes you do it in teachable moments, right? So one time my son, when he was maybe about 8, we were picking up a pizza, and one of the drivers for the pizza place was coming out with a stack of pizzas, and they were transgender. And this person didn't pass exceptionally well. And my son didn't have much of a filter. So after he had walked by, my son said to me, "Dad, what was going on with that guy?" And so this was looked like a biological male who was presenting as a female. And I said to my son, "You know what? Most people, their experience of their gender as like you're a boy and I'm a man, that reflects how God created their biology in terms of like that dad has a penis, you have a penis, and so we're created a certain way, and those things correspond with each other. But in rare instances, the one does not reflect the other. And I think we just met someone where that's not lined up the way that God intended at creation. And I would imagine that's a pretty difficult thing for that person to figure out. Mm-hmm. And I think you're seeing someone trying to figure it out, trying to find a way forward with that. So anyway, I just used words that would make sense at his age, my son's age. And I erred on the side of compassion, of empathy. Imagine what that would be like if that was something that a person experienced, because I think that he benefited more from that than me making a strident statement against this person. How do we know what we would do in that situation if we weren't, ever in that situation? Now, so that was a little bit of compassion, but I also said this was what God intended. God intended this at creation, that people's experience of gender identity would correspond with their biology. I'm saying it now to you as grown-ups, but like I would say something similar to that at his age. That's developmentally appropriate for an 8-year-old, right? You don't have to get it right every conversation you have. You can have multiple conversations and make slight improvements every time.
Thank you.
So
God.
don't worry
Yes.
so much. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we'll watch The Amazing Race and have conversation, just things that come up. Like you just want to have a conversation that's teachable moment when they're curious, when they ask a question. And I just don't want parents to be so afraid to step into this space that they don't know how to hold their conviction. So some of it is like, what would I actually say? So maybe practice a little bit in the mirror. If your son said that to you, what would you say? And then how would you say it? When would you say it? Now, teachable moments, you got to kind of do it right then. Other times you have to be a bit strategic about when you're going to have a conversation. I wouldn't have done that probably in front of a number of his friends together. I think I might have waited to have a conversation with just him. There might be some of those situations if I'm camping or in youth ministry and I'm, we're in this moment, I might try to teach to a larger group of people or something like that. But I'd be careful about the timing of what I'm trying to say, the tone of what I'm trying to say. And just keep in mind, you're respecting that this person bears the image of God. God wants a relationship with that person, just as he does with you and your son and your daughter. So there's no sense in sort of demonizing the person who's making decisions that you think you wouldn't make if you were in their shoes. There's just no purpose in that. So you want to honor the fact that God made them to bear his image. And maybe they're making decisions that you wouldn't make. But the fact is, if they're not a Christian, they don't have the reference points that you have or that I have in this conversation. And so ultimately, what you might want to think about is, how do I help the person or my children's friends know Christ? Like that's actually a more important decision than navigating these questions of gender, as important as these are. And they're not going to have the point of reference of scripture or revelation that would shape the decisions that they're facing if they don't have that relationship. So you'd want to make sure that you keep the main thing, which is the relationship with Jesus and the opportunity to know him. And that's usually interpersonally mediated, meaning how people who bear the name of Christ, the little Christ, which is what Christians means, the little Christ represent him to the world around them. That's why ambassadorship is a really important thing to try to embody, both as a parent and as you talk with your kids about their friends. You want your kids to be ambassadors too, because they're going to have access to relationships that you don't have.
Yeah, I really love just the posture, to use your word, that you're approaching that with your son and then with those around you. I think the nuance that we face that I just want to add to the equation is a lot of people who profess to follow Jesus and also are in their process of sexual and gender identity. Here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of the both and those are the conversations we're having with our girls all the time. That's confusing. They do go to church. They are, come in a Christian family, and they present as bi or on the spectrum of different places. There's a lot of identity. And so even the same framework of we're all in process and we're all working through. Scripture does speak differently about those that say they follow Christ versus those that say they don't follow Christ. So it gets pretty nuanced the older our kiddos get, Dr. Mark Yarhouse, and the more, questions that they're coming. But your point is to see them as an image of image bearer of Christ or of God, and to be able to have compassion for their story, their process, and not just box them in. And the language we use can sound more on the hate side, which is not a reflection of God's heart at all. Right. But when would you say it's time to get more clear? That is a question I get a lot from our community up here in the Pacific Northwest, where we have a lot more Christians on the left side, meaning you don't even know if they're believers, because they're really trying to hold space for all the varieties. So this is the question I'm getting asked all the time. How do we bring clarity? How do we start? So speak about that with our kids. Are we needing to be overt in talking about the creation story? I'll stop there. I'm going on. I have lots of questions for you, Dr. Yarhouse.
Oh, yeah. I think being clear, absolutely, as a parent, as you raise your kids, as you teach them about sexuality and gender, as you teach them about God's plan for sex and gender, I think it's good to be clear. I know we're talking about the book I wrote, but there's a really good book by one of my mentors, Stan and Brenna Jones, called How and When to Tell Your Kids About Sex. And it's a book for parents to have these conversations. And then there's a 4-book series called God's Design for Sex that they wrote as companions to the big book for the parents. And the companion books are based on developmental stages of your child. So if they're 3 to 5, read this book. If they're 5 to 8, this book, 8 to 11, and then a book for adolescents. And it kind of illustrates the point I'm making, is that these conversations, you have them more than once. You have them at different developmental stages. They'll mean different things at different stages. But you have the conversations, and they're not always one conversation. It's you return to things as it's appropriate. They'll have questions, or they maybe don't want to talk about it, but you feel some responsibility to teach them some things. And so you return to those lessons. I think those are really important things to do. So you would do the same thing with gender. Like I did with my son that one time, but talking to them about God's intention. So we're talking here about creation, right? What was God intending at creation? So this is what we believe as Christians. And now it sounds like they may run into other Christians who don't hold this the same way we do, but this is what we believe. This is what our faith community believes, our denomination believes, and this is what we think. And so, however, we don't live in creation. We live in a time that's touched by the fall. So some experiences are not going to line up with what God intended at creation. That's not just exclusive to this conversation about gender. It's all kinds of things and we can point to in the world that aren't the way they were supposed to be. So compassion, respect for that. But we're also not left in a place of the fall. We're in a place of redemption. God is actively at work redeeming his creation. And this is where it's a little more tough to know in that chapter of redemption, how should we live with discordant gender identity or different experiences like this? And I think people may disagree about that. There may be some latitude we give to one another, and we should probably have some compassion because we don't know what we would do if we weren't facing the same thing. So let's walk gently with people in that space. And it's probably going to be, just as important, maybe more important, how we hold these truths and how we extend the relationship, because God's placed us in a relationship with your friends at school, with the parents that I know of your friends at school, with our neighbors in our community, with our extended family. We want to extend these relationships. So I'm probably sounding more compassion, empathy, and you're asking, well, when do we speak truth? well, we do speak truth. But I think I see the opposite problem for most evangelicals. We tend to be so worried that we're not speaking truth enough. It's like an egg timer goes off in the kitchen every 20 minutes, and we have to tell them, did I tell you I disagree with you about this? Like, I think, if anything,
that's the fear.
many people seem to be aware that Christians disagree with decisions that they're making or whatever, but they don't realize that Christians love them or that God loves them. And it's coming out of this relationship that you have with them. So I probably err a little bit on the side. Maybe I'm being over compensatory here, but of demonstrating more compassion and empathy. But that doesn't mean, I go to plenty of places and I say, as an evangelical, this is what I believe. But I just don't do it by shouting at people. It doesn't make any sense. I have if it's another believer or someone who's self-professing to be a believer, I'll talk with them about that. I'll usually ask them first, how did you reach the conclusions you've reached? What was that journey like for you? Because obviously you feel very strongly that the place you're in is the right place. And I imagine that that's been a bit of a journey. And then I just settle in, I get my cup of coffee and I listen. You can't really, I think most Christians want to have the platform. We want to be telling people. Well, the time that you can talk usually follows the time you have invested in listening. So listen first, be respectful, let them talk about it. And I mean, genuinely listen, not listen with your response, ready to go. Like how they got there is fascinating. I remember talking to one pastor, he called me and he said, look, I have a 52-year-old transgender person. They said they'd like to visit the church this Sunday. They have no idea what that would be like. So they wanted to call the office and see if we could get coffee, see what that would be like if they visited church Sunday. And so could we get coffee? So I hung up on them and I'm calling you. They're calling me. The pastor's calling me. And I said, well, hang up with me, call them back and take them up on the offer to meet for coffee. And here's what I want you to do when you sit down with them. I want you to tell them that you say to them, I feel like I'm meeting you at about chapter 7 of your life. And I haven't had a chance to hear about chapters 1 through 6 yet, but I'd like to. And I guarantee that they've never had a pastor open that up for them in that way. I mean, how could you shepherd this? If they came to your church and decided to become a member and sit under your spiritual authority as a shepherd of the church, how could you shepherd them at this point of their life if you didn't understand what brought them to this point, right? So you've got to hear that through a good, we would call it an assessment, but you're just asking about the chapters that preceded this. What I do know is that God brought them into a relationship with you as a pastor. They want to talk with you about their experience, and they seem to be genuinely pursuing a relationship with God at some level. So you're shepherding that. And to do that well, let's hear about how they got there. So in a sense, for parents, you're kind of doing the same thing. When you talk with people who self-profess as followers of Christ and they've landed in a very different place, show some curiosity about how they got there, what went into that. I'm asking you to think about your convictions, how you arrived at them, how you're going to hold them, how you're going to talk about them with people in a way that shows genuine love and respect for people around you, even people who disagree.
Man, can you imagine us raising children who can do that?
He can imagine it. That's why he's investing in this.
I love it.
That's why we're investing in it too. We want to see that more and more, right? Dr. Yarhouse, just appreciating the fact that there is, in keeping the main thing, it's actually, so much, this is not either or thinking. This is us integrating our a good theology across the board of our lives, not just around this topic, but about anything. And you're encouraging and supporting and challenging ministry leaders to do likewise in that space with whoever is coming through the door. Right? What a wonderful thing to begin a process of people feeling a sense of being seen, and just like the master did, our master, the Lord Jesus himself. So the greatest trauma-informed counselor of all time, Jesus Christ.
Here we go.
So we like to say.
I love it.
Well, another question for you is just relating to seeking the kind of clinical help that many people feel like they don't even know what to do. And mental health professionals, there are a lot of poor mental health professionals in the world and have gotten bad reputations for bad practices. That's why we have ethical boards and all kinds of things trying to do something about that. In the Northwest, we're trying to do something about that, have been trying to do something about that for quite some time, to be a trusted resource for people to come to process these things in the way in which you're talking about. Tara and I both heard Dr. Mao speak on convicted civility, so we smiled when you said his name. Wonderful, wonderful. What would you say to the parents, to people who are looking to seek professional help? What are some important components that you would say, look, to find, kind of weed out the poor, if you will, and that's not a judgment, but to really find people who are practically going to be able to help this from integrating a Christian worldview, but who are trauma informed, who are well equipped? What are some of these things that you would say, hey, here's some things to look for?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, to begin with, I mean, that's going to be difficult. This is a difficult space to find people who have expertise around gender identity and expression. Just as we talked about it being a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of its growth, almost as an industry. And that, which is a scary thing to kind of even frame it that way, but just the expansiveness of it. Clinicians have not kept pace with the need, just as with trauma care, other issues. People are there's just not enough clinicians to go around for the needs that exist. And you talk about a specialty niche like gender dysphoria, that's going to be difficult. I think I'd be wary of people who don't appear to be able to take your faith seriously. So, like when I meet with people, and I have an outward facing clinic, I do consultations for families around gender. People fly into Chicago from all over the country, and we do day-long evaluations around gender dysphoria and things like that. Now we're left with, they leave and they have to go back to home and they have to figure out ongoing care. And that's the thing you're asking about that would be challenging. But people should assess both your gender and your faith. They should be assessing the things that really are shaping what appears to be a conflict for the person, your family member or yourself as parents. They should take your faith seriously. They should take, I think, the reality of gender dysphoria. I think this is a real experience. I don't think it's made up or something that we've never had before. So in other words, I think we call it gender dysphoria, but something like this has existed throughout history and across cultures. And so some cultures revere it, some cultures demonize it, some cultures pathologize it, some criminalize it. And I think we're in a moment right now where we largely thought of it as either a vice or a mental health issue. And we're rapidly moving towards a space of celebrating diverse gender identities. And I think Christians are kind of caught in their heels trying to know how to respond to that dramatic cultural shift. So a clinician who sort of gets that you're a Christian, they get that you're a person of faith, and that you want that to be a part of assessment and recommendations, things like that, would be a big part of it. I don't think you want to work with someone who's so eager to move your child in a direction that generally the better clinicians I see in this space are willing to explore gender identity with a child or an adolescent, but they don't have a fixed outcome that they're trying to get them to a certain place. Whereas I think clinicians can sometimes manipulate an outcome or try to achieve an outcome rather than really sitting with the young person while they're in that space. And what if there were other concerns? People in this space, young people in this space, often report co-occurring mental health concerns like depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, autism spectrum conditions, ADHD. Is the clinician you're going to see, are they doing a more comprehensive evaluation to see what's going on? Not that I'm not suggesting that there wouldn't also be gender dysphoria, but maybe there's other things. Maybe they're fleeing gender norms from online social bullying, and they're landing in this place as a way to a safe haven for a few months or years even. I want to at least have assessed that that's a possibility. Maybe they do have a trauma background, and that has meant they don't feel safe as the gendered self that they are. You would not want to make decisions about gender if there's untreated trauma, there's untreated depressive disorder, untreated anxiety disorder. So another thing that I would look for is when they come up with a treatment plan, are they acknowledging these other co-occurring issues, and are they willing to treat those other co-occurring issues first, in a sense, like you would sort of prioritize them. They don't have to be completely gone, but they have to be well managed so that you're making better decisions about gender in light of lessened, anxiety, depression, after effects of trauma, things like that. So there's a lot of things there that I would listen for if I was a parent taking a child in today for a kind of a balanced care. I don't think the clinician needs to necessarily be a Christian to take your faith seriously. They should be very good in this area. It's very hard to find people who are strong in this area who don't have an agenda. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be the hardest mm-hmm. part. So I don't say that flippantly. I just think it's really challenging for me to find referrals for people and for families to find good people.
It's true. And the caution is very real for a lot of Christian families, but they need sometimes that added support because of the other dynamics that are happening for their kids as well. So I appreciate your word on that. We'll try to provide some resources, but you've got Dr. Yarhouse's resource. You have livingwholehearted.com. You can go to and find our clinicians, and we try really, again, to hold the both and then refer when needed. I do think I want to ask you one last question before we end on a hopeful note. We're going to ask you to leave our listeners with a word of encouragement before we close. But I am curious about the recent article that came out in the UK where they had banned overt movement towards, I think it's banned to have any sort of transition, medical assistant transition for adolescents, for children and youth. Did you read that article, Dr. Yarhouse, that came out in March?
Yeah, I think the way I read it is they were putting a stop to ongoing, like to general broad services that were medically affirming to minors unless they were under a research protocol. So a research protocol would allow you to do this, but it would be studied and there would be consent and there would be all these added protections that you mm-hmm. get when you do research. But just to have the average clinic, and in the UK, it had historically just been one clinic, and I think they're going to have regional clinics now, and they're going to do more robust research. And you're seeing that in a couple of other European countries. They're not saying they're not going to do it in many cases. They're saying we're going to do it in a much more rigorous research way. But it does mean a lot of people who then would have had access to care, the kind of care that we're talking about, would have less of that because they have to be in a research protocol. That's how I understood that.
Okay. I was thinking more about hormone and actually overt transitions happening. That's versus right. The majority of the population coming in oftentimes aren't moving that direction. They're just, again, processing at least most of the clinicians that I'm working with in their caseloads. I was just curious if you read that and what you think that is, how that's going to inform any care here in the U.S. Or if we're years out from anything influencing what we do here.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think the U.S. sees themselves as needing to respond to changes other societies make. So like, let's say the UK says we're going to pull back and only do this under tightly controlled research protocols. Let's say Sweden, Norway, Finland do something similar. I don't know that the U.S. sees that and says, we'll follow suit. I think the U.S. sees themselves as a little bit more, we don't have one clinic for the country. We have dozens and dozens of clinics that are working in the area of gender. We don't have one protocol. We don't have one way of assessing, one way of doing interventions. So I think in the U.S. we're much more polarized. There's much more of an emphasis on, are you trans-affirming, sufficiently trans-affirming? And if you're not sufficiently so, prove it by these things. And if you're not, then you're transphobic. And so you get blacklisted pretty quickly. And I don't think you have that in the other countries that I've visited. I don't think you have that same level of polarization. There seems to be greater willingness to work together for the common good and to not demonize one another's positions in reaching something good for young people. I see more polarization in the U.S. that I think is only ultimately going to hurt families.
Yeah, that's the sad part. And while you're advocating, and we're advocating together for your 3 C's as cultural ambassadors.
Yeah.
And those are compassion, civility, and conviction. And so leave our audience here, Dr. Yarhouse, with a little bit of hope. The listeners that might be here, if they may be a parent, they may be an educator, they may be a professional, they may lead a business, and they're navigating labor laws. And I mean, there could be teachers. What would be your great hope for them here today?
Well, I mean, mostly what I wanted to say in this book is that you can do it. Right? You probably have not had much of a roadmap for how to do it. A lot of times parents are just not sure what to say. Like, give me the language. Let me borrow your language. And I do that in this book. I give a lot of transcripts of exchanges that I would give parent to child. Here's what I'd recommend you say. Borrow my language until you kind of find your own voice. Okay. I think things like that will give you confidence. And ultimately, this is not a surprise to God. God is not sitting up in heaven, wringing his hands, wondering, what's going on. God is aware. God is sovereign. God is on the throne. He will guide us and give us the words to say, the wisdom in these situations. They're difficult, but we have faced a lot of other difficulties throughout history as Christians. God has always provided. So I think you can have confident, sort of a realistic biblical hope in God's providence, God's sovereignty, his provision for you, even at this time.
So good. Thank you for your time. Tell people where they can get this book and your resources, Dr. Yarhouse.
Yeah. So it's at Bethany House, which is under Baker Publishing Group. It's also on Amazon. And my website is at wheaton.edu/SGI for the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute, so SGI. And that's how you can, you'll probably have links to it, but that's how you can find our work as well.
Yeah, we'll put those in the show notes for sure.
And the book is Talking to Kids About Gendered Identity, a roadmap for Christian compassion, civility, and conviction. Dr. Yarhouse, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad we could do this.
Until next time, you have questions, you have needs, feel free to email us directly at tara@livingwholehearted.com or jeff@livingwholehearted.com. We're happy to connect you with resources. We're just excited to be connecting with you on a regular basis. Share this podcast with someone else that would be encouraged, needs to hear this message, and go get this book. All right, until next time.
Well, did you know that we're not just podcasters? One of the best ways to connect with Tara and I and our whole team at Living Wholehearted is our website, livingwholehearted.com. There you're going to find the books that we've written, our e-courses, executive coaching, organizational development, and professional counseling services. And then one of our favorite things that we're up to these days, our Wholehearted Leadership Cohorts, where we take groups of leaders for 1 to 2 year journeys together. It's amazing. While you're there, for fresh content, make sure that you sign up for our e-newsletter. That's where we're putting out stuff every month that you want to keep close with. So visit livingwholehearted.com.
You can also join us on socials at living_wholehearted on Instagram, and we are Living Wholehearted on Facebook. You can also follow me at Tara Matson on Instagram. We love to engage with you personally there, so make sure you reach out. Leave us a review if you're enjoying this podcast.
Hey, thank you for caring about being the kind of person and leader that lives with integrity.